It began with small things. David and Caroline Wilkes had been searching for a home in Los Angeles for months before they stumbled upon the Spanish-style villa in the Hollywood Hills. It was charming yet grand, with ivy creeping up its stucco walls and arched doorways that whispered of old Hollywood glamour. When the realtor mentioned that the house had once belonged to Glynis Johns, the legendary actress known for her role in Mary Poppins, Caroline's eyes lit up. "She was one of my mother's favorites," she murmured, running her fingers over the marble countertop in the kitchen. David, more pragmatic, focused on the fact that the house had been on the market longer than expected, giving them room to negotiate. The deal was sealed within a month. They moved in during a warm autumn afternoon. The air smelled of jasmine from the overgrown garden, and golden light streamed through the stained glass windows. It felt like a house with a history, but nothing about it suggested anything unnatural. Not at first. The first incident was subtle. Caroline had been playing old jazz records in the study when she heard a soft humming. At first, she thought it was part of the song, a barely there harmony blending with the crackling vinyl. But when she stopped the record, the humming continued. A lilting, melodic hum, unmistakably feminine. It faded before she could pinpoint the source. Then came the perfume. A delicate floral scent, neither hers nor David's, began to drift through the house. It wasn't constant, just the occasional hint of something familiar yet unplaceable. "Maybe it's in the walls," David suggested when she mentioned it. "Old houses trap scents." She let it go. But then the laughter started. Late one night, Caroline woke to the distant sound of laughter, light and musical, like someone recalling an amusing memory. She nudged David, who grumbled something and turned over, oblivious. But Caroline sat up, straining to hear. The laughter floated down the hallway, near the sitting room where Glynis had once entertained guests. Still, she told herself it was nothing. But when the piano played by itself, there was no denying it. Caroline had been rearranging bookshelves in the den when the soft chime of a piano key echoed through the house. Just one note, gentle and hesitant. Then another, and another. By the time she reached the parlor, the melody had formed a slow, measured tune played with elegant precision. There was no one at the piano. The keys moved on their own, striking the notes with an eerie grace. The smell of perfume was thick in the air now, almost as if someone was standing right beside her. And then, a whisper so close she felt the breath against her ear. "Do you like it?" Caroline screamed. David rushed in, but by the time he arrived, the room was silent. The air was still. The piano sat untouched, its keys perfectly in place. Over the following weeks, they tried to rationalize it. Drafts, old wiring, imagination. But the incidents became more frequent mirrors reflecting a woman who wasn't there. Music swelling from nowhere, objects moving just slightly from where they had been left. The presence wasn't violent, but it was undeniable. Caroline did research. She read about Glynis, her love of music, her effortless charm, her wit. She had lived in the house for decades, entertaining guests, playing piano, telling stories late into the night. And Caroline began to wonder, had she ever truly left? One evening, with a mix of courage and desperation, she sat at the piano and whispered into the empty room, "We love your home. We mean no harm." For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a warm breath of air brushed against her shoulder, as if someone had passed by. The piano lid closed gently, as if in approval. And then, for the first time since they moved in, the house felt at peace. The days settled into a quiet, watchful rhythm. The house never fully asleep, never entirely still. Caroline moved through the rooms with the careful awareness of a guest in someone else's home. Despite owning the deed, despite placing her own books on the shelves and her own flowers in the vases, there were moments when she would pause, sensing a shift in the air, a ripple of something unseen, and she would hold her breath, waiting. Sometimes nothing followed. Other times, a faint echo of perfume trailed her footsteps, or a shadow in the mirror seemed slower to disappear than it should have been. David, ever the skeptic, dismissed it all with casual shrugs and logical explanations. "Old houses settle," he would say, sipping his morning coffee while the wind made the wooden beams creak. "You're just looking for signs because you want there to be something." He would say this even as the record player turned itself on in the dead of night, even as the chandelier swayed without a breeze, even as Caroline woke to find her books rearranged into neat, thoughtful stacks she did not remember making. And yet, despite his doubt, there was a quiet unease in his movements, an occasional glance over his shoulder when he thought she wasn't watching, a tension in his fingers when he reached for a light switch in a dark room. The house breathed around them, and though he would never admit it, David was listening too. Caroline took to spending afternoons in the sitting room, where the sunlight spilled golden through the tall windows, painting the floor in shifting patterns. It was here, more than anywhere else, that she felt at most the presence, the quiet awareness of someone just out of sight. The piano stood against the far wall, its polished surface gleaming, its ivory keys patient. She had stopped fearing it. One crisp October afternoon, as the wind rattled the bougainvillea against the courtyard walls, she sat on the bench and rested her fingers lightly on the keys. A hesitant chord filled the air, rich and resonant, and she exhaled, pressing another, then another, until a melody began to form, slow and tentative. The house listened. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the reach of sight, someone hummed. She did not stop. Her fingers moved with careful reverence, coaxing out a tune she did not fully know but somehow recognized. Something timeless, something familiar. The humming remained soft, barely more than a breath, but steady, constant. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Caroline's fingers faltered, the last note lingering in the heavy stillness that followed. The air was thick with something unspeakable, a presence so near, so tangible. She could almost feel it pressing against her skin. She turned her head slowly, heart hammering, eyes scanning the room. The perfume was strong now, roses and something deeper, something like time itself. The curtains shifted slightly, though there was no open window, and the chandelier overhead swayed as if someone had just passed beneath it. A whisper, soft and lilting, brushed the edge of her hearing. "Lovely, my dear," she gasped, jerking back from the piano, her hands flying to her mouth. The words had been unmistakable, warm with amusement, thick with an accent that belonged to another era. And then, like a breath fading into the wind, it was gone. David found her moments later, pale and shaking, her hands still trembling in her lap. He knelt beside her, concern etching lines into his face. "What happened?" Caroline looked past him, beyond the room, into something unseen. "She spoke to me." David stiffened, his expression darkened, wary, unwilling. "Caroline, I heard her." He let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face, glancing toward the empty room as if expecting to see something, as if maybe, for just a second, he believed. But there was nothing, only the fading light of afternoon, the hush of a house waiting for nightfall, and the silent, patient keys of the piano. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unbroken, as if the house itself was listening, waiting for something more. Caroline remained on the piano bench, her fingers curled uselessly in her lap, while David, still kneeling beside her, exhaled sharply and pushed himself to his feet. He crossed the room with deliberate movements, his footsteps slow but firm, his eyes flicking toward the corners of the ceiling, the darkened archways beyond. "Did you see anything?" His voice was quieter now, stripped of its earlier skepticism, as though saying it any louder might invite a response he didn't want. Caroline shook her head. "No," she whispered. "Just heard." David's jaw tightened, his hand resting against the back of the armchair nearest to him, fingers drumming against the upholstery. He was searching for an explanation. She knew some reasonable, logical thing to say that would fold this moment into something he could understand, something he could dismiss. But when he turned to her again, his face was unreadable. "I need a drink," he muttered, disappearing into the adjoining room where their small bar cart stood beside the window. Caroline let out a slow breath, staring at the polished surface of the piano, at the reflection of the chandelier above. The scent of roses had faded, But there was something else now, something deeper, older, like dust settling after movement, like the way a room feels just after someone has left it. She reached out, pressing a single key. The note rang clear, unaccompanied this time. No humming, no whisper, no presence lingering just beyond reach. It should have made her feel better. Didn't. She rose from the bench, the fabric of her sweater pulling slightly against her arms as she wrapped them around herself. The sitting room, bathed in the last golden remnants of the evening, felt both too large and too small at once, the walls pressing in and stretching away in equal measure. From the next room, the sharp clink of ice against glass. Caroline moved toward the doorway, her bare feet making no sound against the hardwood floor. She found David standing at the bar, rolling the heavy crystal tumbler between his fingers, watching the amber liquid swirl against the light. "She spoke to you?" he said finally, his back still to her. It wasn't a question. Caroline hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." David let out a short, humorless laugh. "And what did she say?" A chill prickled at the back of Caroline's neck as she repeated the words, slow and careful, as if saying them aloud might change them somehow. "Lovely, my dear." David's fingers tightened around the glass. He didn't turn around. A strange sensation curled in Caroline's chest, something unnameable, something cold. The moment stretched long between them, filled with the distant hum of traffic from the hills below, the occasional creak of the house settling, the quiet sound of ice melting in his drink. Then, finally, he spoke. "She said the same thing to my mother." Caroline felt the breath hitch in her throat. Her feet remained rooted to the floor, her pulse slowing, thickening in her veins as she watched the rigid line of David's shoulders, the way his fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the glass to his lips. "What?" The word barely escaped her. David sighed, running a hand through his hair before turning to face her at last. His eyes, shadowed and thoughtful, met hers with something unreadable beneath them. "My mother was a pianist," he said. "Not professionally, just she played for herself, for the house, for me when I was little. She loved old show tunes. Gershwin, Cole Porter. She played A Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square almost every evening." Caroline swallowed. "That was the song I played earlier." David's grip on the glass tightened. "My mother grew up here, Caroline. In this house." He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "I never told you because I didn't think it mattered. We moved out when I was a kid, long before Glynis bought it. But my mother always used to say this house had a personality, a presence." Caroline's skin prickled. "She used to tell me that when she played the piano," he continued, "sometimes she would feel something, someone, watching, listening." His voice was steady, but his fingers tapped once against the glass, betraying his tension. And every so often, when she finished a song, she would hear it. He met Caroline's gaze, something almost defiant in his eyes, as if daring her to challenge him. That same voice. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Lovely, my dear." A hush fell between them, thick and suffocating. Caroline felt the weight of the house settle around her, the walls seeming closer, the air heavier. The chandelier in the sitting room swayed slightly, though neither of them had moved. A gust of wind rattled the window pane, a deep, resonant sound that felt almost like a sigh. David set his glass down with more force than necessary. "I need some air." Without another word, he turned and disappeared onto the terrace, leaving Caroline alone in the dimming room, the scent of roses curling faintly in the air once more. Caroline stood motionless, the warmth of the room suddenly thin, stretched taut over something unseen. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was waiting. The terrace door clicked shut behind David, his footsteps fading into the night beyond the arched entryway. The house was quiet again, but not empty. Never empty. She crossed back to the piano, her movements slow, deliberate, as though stepping too hard might stir something lurking just beneath the surface of the air. The dark wood gleamed under the soft glow of the chandelier, its surface cool beneath her fingertips. She traced the edge of the keys but did not press them, afraid of what might follow. She turned instead to the bookshelves lining the far wall. They had belonged to Glynis, or at least to whatever owner had come before her. Caroline had yet to sort through them, and the shelves remained in a state of curated neglect, rows of aged hardcovers, their spines cracked and worn, stacked alongside glossy coffee table books full of black and white photographs. Her fingers drifted over the bindings, pausing at a slim volume with a faded navy cover. Hollywood Nights, a memoir. The gold lettering was nearly rubbed away. She pulled it free and flipped it open, dust rising from the pages in a soft exhale. Inside, the author's name was scrawled in old ink, Glynis Johns. Caroline's breath hitched. She turned the page with reverence, her pulse thrumming in her ears. The introduction was written in that crisp, effortless style she recognized from Glynis's interviews, wry, elegant, full of a quiet amusement that seemed to echo through the years. There are houses that do not belong to their owners. There are owners who never truly leave their houses. I have been both. The words sent a shiver down Caroline's spine. She traced them lightly with her fingertips, almost afraid they might vanish if she touched them too hard. Further down the page, another passage caught her eye. A home is made of more than wood and stone. It is made of voices, of laughter, of music. And sometimes, if a home loves you enough, it will not forget you. A sharp gust of wind rattled the window pane behind her. Caroline whirled, the book clutched tight in her hands. The chandelier above swayed gently, its crystals catching the light in slow, deliberate motion. The scent of roses thickened, and then a sound. Soft, close, a whisper of fabric shifting, the faintest sigh of movement against the hardwood floor. She wasn't alone. Her breath came shallow, her grip tightening on the book as she turned her head by inches, her body rigid with the effort of listening. The house held its breath with her. Then, just beyond the piano, something flickered, a shimmer in the air, like heat rising off pavement. A distortion, almost imperceptible, just at the edge of her vision. Caroline didn't move. The shimmer deepened, took shape, not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough to see the outline of a figure, slender and poised, standing by the piano as though waiting to take a seat. A woman. Caroline's heartbeat thundered against her ribs. The presence was not solid. Not quite shadow, not quite light. It shifted in and out of form, as though the space itself had not yet decided whether it would allow her to be seen. But the impression was unmistakable. A woman, standing at ease, her head tilted slightly in observation. Caroline's throat went dry. Her fingers clenched against the book's worn cover. The shape did not move. Presence not oppressive, but watchful. A feeling of something vast and timeless pressing just against the veil of the visible world. And then, a breath. Not hers. Not David's. A whisper of movement, and then so soft it could have been imagined. "Lovely, my dear." The book slipped from Caroline's hands, the sound of its fall lost beneath the rush of her own pulse. The shimmer faded, retreating like a tide, drawn back into the unseen depths of the house. But the air was not empty. The house was not empty. Somewhere, beyond the veil of sight, Glynis Johns remained. Caroline stood frozen, her breath shallow, her pulse a frantic rhythm against the silence. The book lay at her feet, its pages fanned open like a gasp. The air was thick with the lingering presence, not threatening, not cruel, simply there. She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping the room, but the shimmer was gone. The piano sat quiet, its keys untouched. The chandelier had stilled. The scent of roses had begun to fade. A sharp knock at the terrace door startled her. She turned to see David standing outside, his expression shadowed, uncertain. She crossed the room and unlatched the door, letting in the cool night air. "I saw something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Caroline swallowed. "So did I." He glanced past her, into the depths of the house, then back at her face. "We should leave." Caroline hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the doorframe. A part of her wanted to agree, to run from the presence that had made itself known. But another part, a deeper, quieter part, understood. "She doesn't want us to go," she said. David exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Caroline, she just doesn't want to be forgotten. David didn't argue. He only looked at her, his eyes shadowed with understanding, and then turned to stare out into the darkened hills beyond the terrace. Inside, the house remained still, watching, waiting. It had remembered Glynis Johns, and now it would remember them too. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.